Thank you. A very warm welcome to my panel today. Distinguished guests, we're delighted to have this discussion. I think starting with the question around margin to mainstream, it's an important 3 words. And I think I'd like to, before kicking off the panel, really ask each of the panelists, what does this mean to you, either from a personal perspective or from a professional perspective? So maybe, Sara, I can start with you. Margin to mainstream. If you can tell us what does this phrase mean, and just in a quick sort of almost a rapid fire round.
Good morning. First, I'd like to thank Shifalika. Thank you so much for having me here and to have this opportunity to be part of such an important conversation. And I think the key word really is about mainstream. All those years ago when I worked at the UN, I was part of UNIFEM, which is now UN Women. There was a lot of talk around this word mainstream, because how do we do this if we have, for example, which we do have, a Department of Women and Child, we have a Ministry of Women and Child. Is that the way to go? But then what does that mean? That all the other, if we're talking about the government, all the other government departments are not looking at women's issues? But then on the other hand, if you don't have a department or a ministry which is looking at women's issues, then does that mean that nobody's doing it? So, it's everyone's problem, but it's nobody's. So this is where we get into that conversation about mainstream. How do we make sure that when we talk about women's issues, it's not just pigeonholed into one issue and done, tick-boxed. It is not. And I think that was what was so pertinent about Shobna ji and about what she spoke about, is that there is no such thing as a woman's issue. What is not a woman's issue? What is something that does not, where we can say that this matters or this doesn't matter. This is something we should look at and this is something we shouldn't look at. It is in policy intrinsically into every single issue. It is looking at design from A to Z. If we're even talking about a safe city, there's a lot of conversation about smart cities, safe cities. Something very simple when Delhi was going through a lot of churning and there was Commonwealth Games and a lot of money was being put into infrastructure, there were a lot of underpasses that were being made. And the women's groups had to go to the chief minister and say, the thing is that this is not, women are not going to access these underpasses. We need those overbridges. The architect said, no, it's ugly. We don't want to make overbridges. But so these are the conversations that need to happen right from the get-go. Right to the smallest to the largest, and until we don't understand this word mainstreaming, we're not going to get into that kind of progression. We're not going to hit the numbers that Shobna ji was talking about. So I think mainstreaming needs to get into capital letters, whether we're talking about parliament, we're discussing that, there are going to be the reservation, we're going to have more women, we're looking forward to that day. All the political parties, of course, have said, and in all their manifestos, they constantly talk about this, but I think we need to move now and we need to look. Words are cheap, it's easy to say, but do we actually do it? So people say it, but are the actions really in line? And I think that's where now we've been talking a lot. We have a lot of discussions. My NGO, CEQUIN, the Center for Equity and Inclusion, we've been working for 16 years now, and we work on women and girls, the empowerment in various different ways. But I see it's really about the action on the ground, and when you work with stakeholders all along, you can really, make huge strides.
Thank you. I think it's an important point that you bring up around safety and access. And at IFC, we actually just invested in JBM, which is e-buses in several cities in India. So we are looking at promoting e-buses, but the most important thing around this investment, we put in about $200 million, was that we've created a program on women's safety. So can women safely ride these buses? This is critical, and I think the point you make around access, we have infrastructure being built, but do we need another layer when we think about women is important. So before I get into the other aspects, I'd like to turn to Vijay and ask the same question. Margin to mainstream. I know you've had a rich history in financial inclusion, but really from your rich and diverse background, what does this mean to you professionally?
Well, since you alluded to financial inclusion, we can begin from there. The first women's self-help group that I was involved with, it was probably one of the first in the country, was in 1987. And for a whole decade after that, the idea that a group of women will get together and save some money and then eventually get a loan from a bank was considered quite, maybe it's something that an NGO can do, but it's never going to find favor with the banks. But very systematic work and support from visionaries like Dr. Rangarajan, the then governor of RBI, and of course with a lot of nudging from people like Ilaben, we are today at a level, and I'm fast forwarding to 2025, where more than, we have more than 1.15 crore self-help groups linked to banks. That is roughly 16 crore women are linked to banks. They are actual borrowers, and last year, 31st March last year, the total amount borrowed was 3,50,000 crores. So, and I have participated in every step of that journey. So, the term margin to mainstream, literally means something to me in just that one field. But one has witnessed so many other fields where the women have moved from the margin to mainstream. But as Shobna ji in her address reminded us that there are certain strategic apex institutions, starting with the parliament itself, but the judiciary and so many others, the administration, but the corporate sector, since we're sitting in FICCI, where there is still a significant deficit compared to what either widely accepted norms are in society, or indeed any other country of comparable economic weight in the world has. So we have and I want to just flag the fact that the famous statistic about female labor force participation rate that's always mentioned in a kind of a lamentation sort of way because the numbers are low. But I think the flaw is not the way, the flaw is the way economics defines labor. If we just put one word before that, the whole thing will become clear. If we said paid labor participation or paid work participation, then almost 100% of women, including, that is unpaid is included in that, then almost 100% female labor participation will happen. The problem is that economics measures only paid labor as labor, paid work as work, and since a vast majority of women's work is happening also inside the home, also for reproductive and other functions, social functions, which unfortunately society does not reward economically. That's why when we look at GDP statistics, it looks as if women are not participating. So it's time we call that bluff. And there are two ways to do that. One is to say, oh, women should do what men do and get paid for it. The other is, hey, women should do what they're doing, but they should get paid for it. Society needs to evolve norms to reward women for their very important and equally important as productive activities, the reproductive roles. And society has to figure out a way to do that. Until then, the fiction that we call GDP needs to be questioned by anybody who understands mainstream economics.
No, thank you. I think a critical point around unrewarded or unrecognized contributions, and I think that's a critical area that we all of us have experienced in our work and also in our personal lives. I think really before I move on to the next question, we look at some of the work around financial inclusion and actually bringing in the self-help group model, which has been critical. At IFC now we're working with the NRLM, the National Rural Livelihood Mission, where we're actually looking at women graduating from a group model to an individual model, and how can we actually help banks reach out to them and lend to them as individuals. We still see them as being viewed as a high-risk segment. Even though they've proved themselves, the NPL rate is very low. So how do we actually work with society, work with private sector banks as well as public sector to really look at giving loans to women and recognizing they are successful entrepreneurs and we can bank on them. So at IFC we're actually working with 3 banks right now on creating a risk share facility so that we can actually pick up the risk and enable the sector to move forward. It will happen in maybe 5 years, 6 years. What can we do for that to happen today? So I think really building on some of these areas. But I'd like to turn to Aradhana. You've been recognized in Forbes Under 30 as one of the prominent leaders. And I think really, again, building on this question around around mainstreaming. We've looked at you yourself have moved from margins to mainstream, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on the corporate sector. Where are the barriers? And I think Vijay's raised an incredibly interesting and important point around reproductive roles, and I know that's a lot of your work, which we'll get into. But just before we go into that, to hear your personal journey and really where do you see this journey for other women in the corporate sector from margins into mainstream?
Thank you, everyone, and especially Shafalika Auntie for inviting me to such an esteemed panel. I feel like I've just entered a few years back, the industry. But when it comes to the corporate sector, I come from a family business background, and I think the idea was to always join that and do something within the family business. But at some of my own personal volunteering experiences across the country made me realize that there is a bigger problem to solve, and Sara ji spoke about infrastructure, Vijay ji spoke about financial inclusion, and for me that passion came from talking about women's health. And I, very personally, I saw girls missing out on schools. When you talk about corporate and workforce, there's a 33% productivity loss when women enter the workforce, right? Because of not having access to period products, not having access to the right kind of information, and they themselves experience a 33% loss in productivity of their work. And that stat sort of hit me somewhere. I said, if I can see my brother going to school and if I can see my dad going to his office, why can't women in the family start doing that as well? Why is this considered a barrier? So from a personal journey, I myself have seen come from margin to mainstream. But in the workforce as well, what we've noticed is just having some sort of normalization around the conversation of period leaves or early menopause or perimenopause, menopause, just talking about that in the workforce, and I mean actual big corporates. There's a huge advantage that we see when it comes to productivity. Women feel like it's a safer place to come to work. Women feel like they can use the bathroom, access to clean toilets, those kind of things. So a big part of what I do is just normalizing and bringing to the mainstream the conversation around women's health and reproductive health.
Thank you for that. I think it's an important point, and when we look at reproductive health, we also look at childcare. And we've seen a lot of women drop out of the workforce at that stage and not be able to come back. So there have been tremendous amounts of programs and work. There's been the Maternity Act in India looking at creche provision, at keeping women in the workforce. But what we did at IFC is we did a global study with banks in Japan, corporates, FMCG in India, and we actually looked at the cost to the business of losing these women. Your recruitment costs, your retention costs were far higher than giving that provision of maternity leave and proper childcare, and subsidizing or supplementing that childcare. So I think, again, we are trying to turn the narrative that it is not only about helping women through that phase, that if you are running a business and you are losing that women, it's going to hit your bottom line if you don't do what you do to keep that women in the workforce and coming back to you after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. I think that's an area that still has a lot of work in just the approach that we take as corporate leaders. So I resonate very much with the words that you've just said. I'd like to turn back to Sara. on this topic. I think we talk a lot about gender empowerment, we talk about programs for women, but we also realize that there's a tremendous role that boys and men play in looking at gender norms. And you've had almost 2 decades of experience working in this sector, but really from your standpoint, how do you see men and women playing a role together? How do you see them as allies to each other? We often have a narrative where it's women, and it shouldn't be women and men. In fact, this is an incredibly important room because I see there is quite a healthy mix of a gender balance. And when we get to the question and answers, I do hope we hear from both the men and women. I think this is critical in our narrative as we move forward. So really hearing from you, your perspective on how can men and boys be allies to women, and any practical experiences that you've come across in your work would be helpful to hear.
You're absolutely right. There can be no conversation, if we're talking about mainstream, we're talking about women's empowerment, this conversation cannot happen with only 50% of the population. In a sense, aren't we only preaching to the converted? So if I am only going into schools and having these conversations with the girls, they pretty much know what the problem is. So we at CEQUIN focus a lot of our work with men and boys, which now is still understood. People see why. When I first started and we would go to funders or to the government and say that we'd like to do some of our work with men and boys, we were always looked at with, sort of aghast, but why? Why do you need to talk to the men and boys? Why are you're an organization that works for women empowerment. Why are you asking for money to work with boys or to do workshops with them? But really it's a very straightforward answer. And the answer is that when we talk about patriarchy, when we talk about structural violence, structural inequality, it actually affects everybody. And that is something that we see when we go down into the villages, when we go down into the grassroots, and we have these conversations with the boys. Very recently we did a leadership workshop with the boys in Mewat. And of course, initially when you have the conversations, they say all the right things. They've also heard the campaigns and they will say, yes, of course, my sister should go to school and do whatever she wants to do. But then as you unpack it and as you have more conversations, one of the boys turned around and he said, Acha, so beti bachao, beti padhao, to bete ko kya karna chahiye? Marna chahiye kya? So they also now are having this churning where those traditional roles, that the girl will be at home and she will look after the home and the boy will go out, or the man or the husband will go and he will be the breadwinner. All these things are also being turned on their heads, because you do have girls and you do have women who are out there in the workforce. So this whole, you have people like Andrew Tate, you have a lot of this very scary toxic masculinity, the conversation that's happening. And so even the mental health of boys and men is something where they need to be able to have that space to come out and talk. It was interesting, even Aradhana talked about in her family, about her father and her brother. So what we say is that these conversations are incomplete if the father and the brother of the family are not, if they don't buy in, if they don't understand why it is something which will be of a positive benefit to everybody. This is not a charity that they're doing. So when we talk to the men and the boys and we say, yes, encourage, if you want to go to school, or if you want to go out and have the opportunity to play football, or then you want to be able to go and have a career, help your sister, walk along with her to the park, or if your dad wants to stop her from going to school and is insisting that, she should start thinking about getting married at age 14, you can be the champion for making sure that that doesn't happen to your sister. But also understanding why this patriarchy affects them. We have had boys who have wanted, for example, to dance. And that is something which is not really accepted in their community. So then they start to understand, okay, if we are talking about gender, we're talking about gender mainstreaming, we're not just talking about a woman and women's issues, we're talking about men also don't fall into this box of how a man should be, macho, a macho man. Who is that macho man? So these conversations actually go a lot deeper, and it's about equality for everyone. We're not saying here that only women should be, riding high, and women should be successful and women should be happy and it's the well-being of women. It's actually the well-being for all.
No, thank you. I think it's it's important that we recognize that it is an intersection, and how do we keep these conversations alive. So really, Vijay, turning to you, looking at, you've worked with many women, social enterprises, you've mentored, you've seen the journey, and looking at value chains, really. How do you see us working with women as not just workers, but as leaders or entrepreneurs, into integrating them into existing value chains, given this backdrop, looking at the roles of women and men, but also seeing how can we bring women into value chains that keeps them growing and rising in a productive way?
See, there are multiple ways in which one can participate in a value chain. The most obvious one is as a worker, and that takes us into the whole issue of enhancing women's work participation rate. And I think that's a topic that is so widely discussed that I don't want to spend time on it. But the real problem, and I'm saying this now for whether women or men, when we are working with farmers, the whole idea of farmer-producer organizations being set up about 15 years ago was to get farmers to get a larger slice of the value added, right? Compared to what the farmer sells at the farm gate to what the consumer pays at the table, there's a huge value added. Can the farmer, the primary producer, get a wider share? And whether we are talking of a male farmer or a female farmer, and by the way, agriculture is significantly feminized, a lot of farmers are actually women now. The problem is not just participating in the value chain. The problem is participating in value chain with adequate capital. Because otherwise you just get marginalized. You get just crumbs from the table. So the real issue, if I have to summarize my 40 years of work with poor people in general and women, is access to capital. And we should not confuse that with access to credit. We think getting a loan means access to capital. No, you take a loan and go and buy a color TV or a motorcycle for your son. You're actually, he may be happy, but you're worse off because, you've already taken everything that you could borrow. But if that loan is used to buy some equipment or start a small business, which makes the woman enhance her income on a steady basis, that loan is something I would call capital. And so the problem is that this statistic that I mentioned earlier, 350,000 crores now flowing to women, a significant part of that has unfortunately become consumption credit or buying, durables and stuff like that, which is partly, this is aspirational and it needs to, who am I to decide that they should not buy color TVs? But if they bought color TVs out of their surplus income, at least to pay the EMI out of their surplus income, that would be different from using the loan, which was to buy something productive and do it. So the real issue therefore is to enhance the access to capital, and the most significant way in which this is done is to start women off in micro enterprises and let them learn the fundamentals of business in relatively safe settings. And a self-help group is one such example. By the way, I worked with both the models, individual borrowers and self-help groups. And in general, women who are embedded in self-help groups, even though they may own an individual enterprise, generally tend to do better because there's a kind of a mutual mentoring, there is learning from each other. There are some safety nets. When there are cash flow shortages in one person's business, the other person helps. Whereas when you're an individual borrower, running an individual micro enterprise, you are basically on your own. And any small or big shock, either in the household cash flow or in the enterprise cash flow, gets you down. So in the early stages, therefore, it would have to be not group enterprises, but individual enterprises embedded in groups. That would be one. However, that's not enough to make a strategic difference to the economy. If we want 50% of the CEOs at Fortune 500 companies to be women, And to get there, or if we want 50% startup entrepreneurs to be women, then we need a different stock of people coming to that. And that is a much longer term societal task, which is investment in education, investment in self-concept, investments in, as I said, revaluing reproductive work, starting from the intellectual work that needs to be done behind that. You know, I mean, the GDP statistics were worked out by Simon Kuznets in 1948. For God's sake, we are still stuck with a way of thinking and calculating the basics of our economy, which are completely outdated. You know, so we need to, starting from that intellectual work, to ensuring that there are women whose entrepreneurial traits are cultivated systematically so that all of society benefits from it. It's a much longer term process. There are no quick fixes. But capital, first financial capital, and second human capital in the form of education, and third social capital in terms of supportive ecosystem are the three things that are badly needed.
Oh, thank you, and absolutely agree. I think I would add one more thing to that, and I think your point is very well taken around access to capital, which is different to access to credit. I would also say access to markets. We've seen in a lot of the work we've done is that when we're able to do business linkages for women, it can be very powerful. We actually did a program in Bangladesh, which was quite simple. We worked with the Marriott group of hotels, and we just had women entrepreneurs come in who made, I don't know, pens or various supplies that a hotel chain would bring. So these were very creative women, but they needed, as you were saying, Vijay, help on running a business. So do you have the right quality? Is it consistent? Are you doing the storage correctly? You're making an excellent product, but what else goes with that? Packaging, some of the accounting skills. And actually it was very powerful to bring these women into just the supply value chain of a large hotel chain to help them grow and serve as demonstrators in their own communities as well. So I think these are wonderful examples and points, and I think if we can also look to demonstrate, that can be very powerful in the work that we do. Aradhana, I wanted to turn back to you around looking at how do we keep women, their education, their continuity, women's workforce participation, and the intersection really with menstrual health. You've done a fair bit of work in this, and we've seen women drop out, girls drop out. So I'd like to hear your perspective on where do you see that intersection, and what can we do as a community or as a society or as an employer to be able to work across this barrier?
Of course. So I think I'll start with just two very heavy stats. The first one that I already mentioned, women dropping out of the workforce, losing productivity as soon as, that whole pregnancy thing kicks in, family planning issues. Also, the second stat is about 25% of school children end up dropping out of school, girl children end up dropping out of school as soon as they hit puberty. One, because they have no information on what periods are, and the second is that they don't have access to any sort of products. This stat has not changed in the last 10 years. And this is a stat, in fact, from a 2011 study that was done. And it still remains somewhere around 22 to 23% where girls are dropping out of school. Some strategies that you're asking for, and the first thought that comes in is what the government usually does, what NGOs end up doing, funders end up doing is start distributing sanitary napkins free of cost. But in my experience, the best solutions that have come out are never to do with just the product, but it's to do with building the ecosystem around it, right? What other panelists have also spoken about, building infrastructure, access to capital, wash facilities. How do we integrate all of this and treat women's health as an important enough topic where infrastructure, economics, policy, wash facilities all can come together and work towards advancing women's health. So some of the examples that I can give from my own personal experience is, different permutations and combinations of combining product with education. So whenever we walk into a community, it's never ki aap pad le lo istemal karne lag jao. It's always to do with what are periods, how do you manage period pain at home at no additional cost to the family. How do you include men and boys into the conversation? Because as honest as one can be, and I'm so happy the word patriarchy has been so openly said in this room, because in a lot of rooms it's not allowed. it is in the very fabric of our gender Indian culture, right? Till we don't include men and boys in the conversation, nothing is going to change in the house, because they do end up making decisions when it comes to which child should go to the school. They are involved in conversations on how much money should I give to my girl child as opposed to my boy child, right? It's still in the conversation on who, even something as basic as who should own a smartphone in the house. Usually you'll see it's either the father or the son, if they don't have money to buy more phones, right? So including men and boys in the conversation has been a huge eye-opening experience for us. And the last thing is, I would say, public-private partnerships really do help us scale. We have worked with some district governments that allow us to work in all schools of that block, all schools of that village, and somewhere, there are some governments that don't even allow us to talk about reproductive health with a 13-year-old. So just those sort of public-private partnerships where it helps us scale from a block to a village to a district is where we've seen the most sort of success. Sorry, I know you also asked about corporates. I think moving just away from token gestures to actually embedding women's health in the very conversations and policies that a corporate has. We at Baala, my organization, we've started this whole care certification for corporates where we're working with big corporates to move from just a great place to work certification to actually having this sort of gender equity, access to information, access to clean toilets. That certificate needs to become an important thing. Right? We work with the highest leadership, we work with the HROs, we work with all levels of the corporates to ensure that they are not just talking about giving a menstrual leave, but also talking about things like flexible shifts in the workplace. Do they have access to products in the bathrooms? Is the staff trained enough to talk about a reusable pad versus a disposable pad versus a menstrual cup? Can a woman go up to her senior manager and say, I am just not being able to handle the heavy bleeding and the pain that I'm feeling, is it okay, can I take a half day? And this is not just to do with periods. Most of the women in the workforce right now are between the age of 35 to 50. And that is when they've had a kid, that means they're entering a perimenopause phase, they're entering menopause. Can they handle menopause at the workplace? Do they have policies for that? So that is something that we're also actively trying to institute in at least the big corporates, and then try to figure out a way of working with the SMEs also.
I think you bring up a very important point. We've seen several programs to promote women in the middle management or senior management. One that IFC works with EDGE, which is Equality and Dividends for Gender, that really focuses on how can we equip women. But I think the women health piece is missing from that. And I think it's a critically important narrative. Often women can feel embarrassed or awkward, or all of us as society, to talk about menstruation, to talk about even toilets and so forth. And I remember particularly, excellent example, I worked a little bit with a woman called Kashmira Mewawala, worked at Tata Capital. And she went to one of the new factories at Tata Chemicals where there were 2 women on the workforce and only a men's bathroom. And she asked the CEO, so where will the women go? And he said, in 2 weeks, we'll build a bathroom. 2 weeks. So she went, she put a women's sign on the men's room door and said, okay, so where are these 2,000 men going to go for 2 weeks, right? In one day, a bathroom was built. So I think sometimes it's ignored, and imagine for those 2 women, how would they have managed through those 2 weeks? Maybe they weren't 200, so that force wasn't there. But even if it's one woman, we've got to create a safe space. We've got to create a proper place for just normal things to be comfortable for them to engage in. I think, again, looking at some of these different ways of doing, looking at mainstreaming women, I want to come back to you, Sara. You've worked a little bit with using sports as a tool, and I think this would be a very interesting room to hear about some of those strategies and how you use sports to actually bring women in to, change the norms around, you mentioned actually males who wanted to dance. We see many stereotypes around sports. Again, often still girls and women are not seen as linked to sports, to teams, to national sports, community sports, and it could be a very powerful tool to keep women in the community, in education programs, or in school, or together as a community. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience through your NGO around that.
It's my favorite topic, so I'm very happy to speak about this because it's almost, I would say, it's like a magic pill. We don't want to reduce this down to the, like least common denominator or make it a very superficial conversation. But really, I have seen in my work when we introduced and we very deliberately chose football. There are many sports. We could go from archery if we're talking about individual sports to cricket or hockey, and there is nothing wrong with any of them. But we did a lot of work and spent a lot of time figuring out that which sport is it that we want to use. So football, firstly, it breaks those stereotypes. If you can just imagine, even here in Delhi, if you were to walk out and when India Gate, the roundabout was, open and free for all, you would have men and boys playing cricket, not so much football. But if you can imagine that any public place, any public park, whether it's Lodi Gardens or Nehru Park or anywhere, if you just had groups of girls playing football, it would make you stop and turn around, and it changes something in the way that you think. So if you can imagine that that is happening in places like Mewat, where we are working in the most, not only backward but very conservative area. And when I started work there in about 15 years ago, maybe you wouldn't even really see women out in public. Let alone girls playing football. And just recently a few of our girls are now playing for the state. So it's something very exciting, because what happens is that these girls who otherwise are not even allowed to go to school, or as Aradhana said, they drop out. I mean, your token, you may be enrolled technically in the school, but are you actually physically going on a daily basis? So for those girls who are not even allowed to go to school, or because they do have the domestic pressures, all that actually still carries on. For them to even have time to play, to go out and to do something just for themselves, it doesn't happen. So we go into the communities, and we either through schools or through mothers collectives, kind of like a self-help group, but not quite self-help group, women's collectives, women who come together, and then they galvanize in the community their daughters or other girls, and then they come out and they play football. And you see these girls within sort of the first day of playing football and then last day of playing football, there is a sea change in their attitude, in their confidence. Something kind of clicks in their mind where they feel so different to what they've ever felt before, and then we see so many things change. It's like a domino. You kind of click the first one and tuck, 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 they all sort of fall. So then they go home, they eat better. They insist that, okay, bhaiya ko anda de diya, mujhe bhi chahiye. Why? Not because they're really interested in their own nutrition or whatever, but they're thinking more about, I'm going to be able to kick that ball harder, I'm going to be able to run faster if I eat more. So then what happens is, as they're eating more, it has a knock-on effect on their studies, because they can concentrate better. So then they do better in school. They also don't want to be thrown out of the football project, which otherwise their parents are going to turn around and say, oh no, you don't have time to go and play football, you should be focusing on your studies. So because they don't want to be thrown out of the football project, they work harder in school. And so then all these things, when you talk about child marriage, none of the girls who have taken part and who have been regularly in our football program, they have not gotten married. And we're not talking about going out there and fighting with everybody and changing the social fabric and, ladai and all. No, because when you work with then the community, we work with all the stakeholders, you have the buy-in of everybody, it happens in a much nicer and a smoother kind of way. And then these girls, you talk, Vijay ji spoke about economic empowerment. It's about money in your hand. So these girls then go on and have become coaches. So, you have, it again, it's about money. Money talks. Then when you go home, it changes the social dynamics. So really, football and sports as a tool for empowerment, as a tool for development, I think there's really nothing like it. So now when you go to Mewat and you have girls across Mewat, across Nu, in Haryana, who are going out and playing football, it really, we say that if a space, if a park, if a market is safe for a girl, it's safe for everybody. It's a no-brainer. So we had a park over here in Delhi, in Simapuri, which otherwise was in a very bad state. It was something that a lot of the drug addicts used to go over there. So you'd have needles, you'd have broken bottles, and we went up there and we cleaned the park. We are not saying that only girls should use it. No, but it's more that, well, now it's well lit. Now we have CCTV. Now we've spoken to the police and the government, so they patrol the park. Now it's safe for the entire community. And how wonderful that is, because again, as we're saying, when we talk about patriarchy, or we're talking about why is it that society should be safer for women and girls, well, that makes it better for everyone.
Thank you, thank you. So I think these, on the theme of looking at really models of keeping girls and women in the education space, in the community, prominent, giving them a role, giving them a space, giving them a voice, these are critical programs. I want to stay on that theme, Vijay, and switch to you, really looking at some of the models of livelihood promotion that you've worked on. I know you have decades of experience and probably too many to choose from, but in a sense, what, if you can touch on maybe one or two models of livelihood promotion that you found have been, the most sustainable, thank you, the most sustainable for women, especially in rural India, that would be useful to you.
So, I already sort of, have alluded to the self-help group model, and I maintain that that still remains the single largest enabler of bringing women out of their traditional roles, out of their homes, first into just, comfortable spaces where they can build solidarity with each other, then slowly learn some skills and even get some business ideas, and then take a loan, start a small business. That whole process, I've personally seen it happen to thousands of women, and it's really gratifying. I know women who Delhi se bahar nahi aati thi, jab baat karne jate the, they wouldn't come out of the threshold. And today, some of them, like one Saraswati ji in Nawada district of Bihar, she is now the president of a self-help group federation which has 12,000 women, and their own collective savings corpus last year was 15 crores. And they've also set up a farmer-producer organization. I mean, their total borrowings from the banks have crossed 100 crores, but their own collective corpus is 15 crores, which is in a bank. So, and this is in Bihar, and of course, South India is yet another country. I mean, what women have gone through in Andhra Pradesh, now Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka to a lesser extent, is just incredible. I mean, and I've had the luck of witnessing that, at different stages. But the next step, which is the breakthrough from just running a subsistence self-employment enterprise to running a proper enterprise where you're employing several others, because a large number of people just want work. They don't want to be entrepreneurs, So now, and the percentage of women in that role, that is owner entrepreneurs, who are employing others, is still very small. And in that, quite honestly, we have not sort of come across any great successful models. I mean, I'm being honest. We've tried many. It doesn't seem to work very well. The ecosystem of support that is required does not exist. But this is a bigger problem of the economy itself. We are an economy where there are a large number of subsistence self-employed, and then there are some, formal enterprises. The middle, which used to be quite a lot at one time, the small enterprises, have kind of withered away, and to the extent they have come up, they are largely in the urban services sector, and for rural women, that's very far away to access. So I've racked my brains on this, and I think that basically we need to figure out a way by which we can promote some digital enterprises, and indeed I'm working with the Nudge Foundation right now to enable home-based enterprises of women to be able to access markets which are non-proximate. Otherwise, normally we say home-based means you sell to the neighbors or anybody who walks to your shop. But thanks to the fact that now there are widespread availability of mobile phones, women are able to use smartphones, they are able to make small websites, show their goods, receive orders on the mobile, receive payments on the mobile, and increasingly the logistics of sending packed goods has improved dramatically. I mean, the kind of packaging material that you now get in a district town is amazing. So we can therefore link. I mean, I think in the next 5 to 10 years we will have a situation just as there was, the cloud kitchen didn't exist 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. I think we'll have rural digital enterprises, of which a large number will be owned by women. And the one big enabler of this was that if you look at secondary enrollment data from 2008 to 2018, so many more girls went to school and finished school. They are now all in their working age. And even if they get married, they have aspirations outside the home. Mm-hmm. And while they want to do some business, they also have home-based duties. So then home-based business is the compromise I'm suggesting, working compromise for the next 15, 20 years. I'm not being revolutionary saying, no, women should just dump their reproductive duties and join the mainstream economy. I think that is unrealistic. But home-based work which is enabled would be the way to go. And therefore credit, digital enablement, access to markets, but through the digital route.
I completely agree with you. At IFC, we recently launched a Center of Excellence for Entrepreneurship with Goldman Sachs, where we're looking at some of these models, because many of the models that we've looked around entrepreneurship have not taken into account where women are, particularly in the rural areas. And we focus on urban transformation, but we at IFC are looking at how can we keep men and women in the rural sector and not have to migrate to urban areas. What is it that we need? Do you need logistics? Do you need infrastructure? Do you need cold storage? And what can we do to support women in these areas, as well as take some of these examples and really test them out, test them in the Center of Excellence, build on them. So this will be bundled with of course, advisory and finance, and we're hoping to do much more around this area, in India in particular. Our Center of Excellence for Entrepreneurship globally will be based in New Delhi. So we really feel that India is an area that we can find some innovative models that are leveraging technology, leveraging digital, particularly looking at how advances India is as a country in the digital space. UPIs. Yes, please.
To give one other idea that we've been working on, which I think is promising. Since now domestic tourism has become very, very common now in India, and not just to pilgrimage centers or hill stations, but much more widespread. And therefore, the whole idea of homestays in locations which are not well known has become, particularly because the well-known locations have all become so crowded that people are constantly looking for other things. And so, homestay based business, where there's a core. I mean, we are right now, for example, working in Ladakh with about 450 homestay owners, and it's possible to. And by the way, a large number of them are women.
Right.
Even if on paper the homestay owner is a man, but mostly they're run by women, and so it's possible to add value to what they already are doing, and increase the incomes by 30 to 40% by just a few changes, such as being able to be listed on a digital platform which is not exploitative, being able to put their best foot forward, simple things like enabling them to have a small web page with the right, showing the right views and furniture and all that, ensuring that they have the kind of facilities that people want, adding value to the local cuisine and local experiences, which in their daily life, ये तो हम रोज ही खाते हैं, इसको कौन बाहर से कौन खाएगा? And people from outside love it. They don't want to be fed chili chicken when they go to Ladakh. They want something local. You know?
Local.
So all of that added up together is generating actually lots more localized employment without moving them from their homes or from their normal other duties.
No, I agree, and I think there's a huge focus on looking at domestic tourism and actually building platforms. We've seen the Airbnbs and so forth. But really, how can we bring women onto these platforms and change that ownership, even if it's listed under a man's name? I think these are not small things to be ignored. I think we also have to look at ownership and recognition. It's critical to take that first step for women. So I think I would hope that platforms that come out actually insist upon this kind of proper paperwork and ownership and access for women genuinely. So I think on this note, I'd actually like to open it up and ask the audience if you have any questions. Please do introduce yourself, and you can address your question to anyone on the panel.
I have a submission.
Yes, please.
My name is Partha Pratim Das, and I had a consulting firm by the name PGI Associates based in Delhi for 16 years. The view that I'm going to share is that if we look at a society, if I'm to structure that, it will get a shape of pyramid. Considering three variables. Variable 1, socio-economic strata or classification, ACC. Variable 2, socio-cultural variations. And third variable is town classes. If we talk about the pyramid, the top of iceberg can be considered as the empowerment which has happened or not. It has happened. It's an umbrella problem that in India, women are not empowered. But there's a vaster base, larger pyramid, wherein empowerment is a need, even as on date. Now, how to pinpoint that? Considering these two variables, the more we go down, town classes from urban to rural. So metro, tier 1, 2, 3, semi-rural, rural. Then socioeconomic classification. Lower the socioeconomic classification ACCs, this is more relevant. Sociocultural classification that we talked about, North India, South India, East, West, the variations. Again, that thing. So if we pinpoint the problem, I think interventions are required more in those regions, rural, say, in the social strata, the lower areas, and they need to be empowered. Talking about self-help groups that we have referred over here in the rural area, the point is, as on it, if I might be wrong, but that's my observation, we have gone for women, utilizing women laborers, but not entrepreneur. As rightly mentioned, we need to have women entrepreneur, but that won't happen if I just have a visiting card. The point is, even today, in a self-help group, women are reluctant to go to the local mandi. If I'm talking about agro-produce, they are working in the farms, they are in the processing part. But when the intervention comes to go to the mandi, males would go. Then how can you say that capital or maybe the recognition, the leadership will come to women? So I think these empowerment, and that thing will happen right from the K-12 intervention, means at the kindergarten level itself. A girl child should voice their needs, should voice their thoughts.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen.
So I agree. No, thank you. I think this is an important point, but I think let's also not jump to say only there are gender issues only in certain areas of society. I can speak for myself, where my father had a PhD from the US. I was a fourth daughter, and I had to fight to go to college and not get married young, like my three sisters ahead of me. So I think we have to recognize when we talk of empowerment, it's across all societies, educated, empowered, accessible. So I take the point very well, but I think let's not only say it's in the villages, it's across the board. It really is. So I was hoping to have a few more questions, but I think we have to call this to a close. We have a very important and interesting speaker next. But just before I close, I want to give 10 seconds to each panelist to give one call to action to the audience around this topic of from margins to mainstream, just in a 10-second round. So to start with you, Aradhana.
I'll keep it to 10 seconds and just say that I think bringing forward the conversation on women's health, because that's what I'm passionate about, but also jaan hai to jahan hai, right? So keep that in mind and bring it from a private conversation to almost like public accountability. And yeah, that would be my call to action, to embed reproductive health in economics, policy, and leadership. Thank you.
Sara? I would say that now it's really time for all of us to walk the talk, whether it's within our personal lives, to be very honest about what's happening in our home, in our family, and the dynamics, right through to our schools, to the government, to any businesses and corporations that we run. It's really about moving from words now to action.
We need a national commission to revalue reproductive work versus so-called productive work based on their real contribution to human well-being.
So, thank you. So with that, I bring this to a close. Thank you.